SpaceX's Raptor engine is at the heart of the company's Starship rocket. 39 of these engines power Starship's 2 stages for launch and landing, and they're key to its future success. This means SpaceX needs to not only produce a mind-blowing amount of engines, but also test them. In this video, we'll explore all aspects of Raptor testing, from what types of tests there are, to where they're tested, how they're tested, and why on earth is SpaceX doing all of these tests in the first place. Sponsored by Novatech. To understand everything relating to Raptor testing, we have to first understand how the engine works. So let's start with the main parts that make up Raptor. You might have noticed that a Raptor engine has a large part of it separate on the side. That piece of hardware is the fuel turbopump assembly, where the Raptor fuel pump, turbine, and preburner are located. The counterpart of this is the oxidizer turbopump assembly, and that is right here at the top of the Raptor engine. Going further down, there's the hot gas manifold, then the injector and main combustion chamber, and finally, the throat and nozzle of the engine. If that sounded like Charlie Brown noises to you, don't fret, we're about to break it down. To know what each of these parts do, we also have to talk about the flow of propellant through the engine. Let's start with methane. Liquid methane enters the engine from the top of the fuel turbopump assembly and into the fuel pump. Here, it is carried to the side to the cooling manifold. This manifold distributes cold liquid methane to the combustion chamber, engine throat, and nozzle, so they don't overheat and break up when the engine is running. This cooling manifold contains little openings around the combustion chamber and throat, so the liquid methane can exit and cool down the inner side of the engine in these areas. This is often called film cooling, since it creates a protective film of cooler exhaust around the inner wall. After cooling all of those hot parts, the methane turns from a cold cryogenic liquid into a hot gas, and here is where it splits in different directions. The vast majority of that hot gaseous methane ends up going to the fuel preburner located on the bottom of the fuel turbopump assembly. Here, a small amount of liquid oxygen is injected into the preburner to burn with all of that hot gaseous methane. The resultant combustion makes the fuel turbine spin, and the turbine drives the fuel pump, allowing the methane to continue flowing into the engine. Now, that's the case for the majority of the hot gaseous methane exiting the cooling manifold, but a small portion of it is tapped off to go to the oxidizer preburner, which we'll discuss shortly. After spinning the fuel turbine, the now even hotter and gaseous methane-rich exhaust from the fuel preburner goes into the hot gas manifold. Can you guess now why it's called that? From the hot gas manifold, this exhaust then goes into the main injector, where it meets with the other half of the engine action. Liquid oxygen, meanwhile, enters the engine from the top of the oxidizer turbopump assembly and flows into the oxidizer pump. From here, it splits in different directions. The vast majority of the liquid oxygen will go into the oxidizer preburner located right under the oxidizer pump. Here, a small amount of hot gaseous methane is injected into the oxidizer preburner to get burned with the liquid oxygen coming from the pump. The resultant combustion makes the oxidizer turbine spin, and the turbine drives the oxidizer pump, allowing the oxygen to continue flowing into the engine. Just like what happened with the methane, there is a small part of the liquid oxygen that is tapped off from the oxidizer pump and goes to the fuel preburner to ignite with the gaseous methane there. With the oxidizer turbine now spinning, the hot gaseous oxygen-rich exhaust from the oxidizer preburner flows down to the injector, where it will meet the exhaust from the fuel preburner. You can see how both paths, the one for the oxygen and the one for the methane, are interconnected with each other. The fuel preburner needs liquid oxygen tapped off from the liquid oxygen pump, while the oxidizer preburner needs gaseous methane tapped off from the cooling manifold. That means both sides of the engine are completely dependent on the other and therefore need to be perfectly in sync. If something were to be off in things such as the timing or the flows of fluids, then that Raptor could have a really bad day. This particular engine cycle is also known as a full-flow staged combustion cycle, a term you may have heard before. This, among many other things, is what makes Raptor one of the most complex engines to run, which is nuts considering SpaceX flies 33 at once on the Super Heavy booster. With the 2 preburners running, their exhausts meet at the engine's injector. Raptor uses what is called a coaxial swirl injector. This type of injector has the methane-rich exhaust surrounding the oxygen-rich exhaust and forces both fluids into a swirl before being discharged at the top of the main combustion chamber. It's here where they collide with each other and combust, producing the entirety of Raptor's thrust. The combustion products flow down the throat of the engine and then expand out the nozzle. There is one last bit of the puzzle here though, and it is that Raptor also helps with Starship and Super Heavy's tank pressurization. This is called autogenous pressurization. In the case of Starship's oxygen tank, SpaceX taps off a little bit of the oxidizer preburner exhaust and puts it back into the tank to pressurize it as it gets drained. This also means the oxygen tank ends up having water and carbon dioxide ices from the preburner exhaust, which has caused problems on early flights. In the case of the methane tank, it's not fully clear whether SpaceX taps off exhaust from the fuel preburner or if they just tap off from the cooling manifold, which already produces hot gaseous methane. Current observations of Raptor 3 suggest that perhaps for that engine, SpaceX will indeed tap off from the fuel preburner for tank pressurization, but Raptor 3 is still very new and very unknown. Okay, now we know where everything goes in the engine, but how does it even start in the first place? Remember that the pumps are driven by the turbines, which are powered by the combustion in the preburner, but for the preburners to work, they need to be fed propellants, which are pumped into the engine by the pump. So you can already see where the problem is. Since the propellants need to start flowing into the engine, the first thing that one needs to do to start the engine is to start the pump. Most engines achieve this by injecting an inert gas at high pressure into the turbines so that they drive the pumps and kickstart the flow of propellant into the engines. Raptor is no different and also does the same. That act of starting the engine pumps by making the turbine spin is called spin start, and it's the very first part of the engine start sequence. As propellant keeps flowing through the engine, both fuel and oxidizer will meet at each of the preburners, but since there's no combustion going on yet, they need a way to start that combustion. To enable that, Raptor has a set of torch igniters on its preburner, which work very similar to a lighter. If it wasn't windy. Oh, hey, that one worked. Hey! The torch igniters use a stream of high-pressure gaseous oxygen and another one with high-pressure gaseous methane. If you put a spark in the middle, bingo! You've got a torch. With the preburner started, the exhausts of each meet at the combustion chamber where they combust with each other on contact, and then leave the engine through the nozzle. Once all combustions stabilize and propellant is flowing at the correct rate, the engine will reach what is called a steady state. That is, as long as you keep supplying propellant, it'll keep running. Also, as long as the materials can withstand the burn, of course. Everything I just said is a lot easier said than done because controlling the flow and timing of propellants throughout the engine is very tricky. You get a higher pressure in one pump or the other, and now you're changing what's happening downstream of that, which is pretty much the entire engine. If you get the startup of the preburners wrong by even a fraction of a second, you might actually stall the pump and break the engine. Or you might end up starving the other preburner and increase temperatures, and you get the point. Despite this complexity, SpaceX is capable of lighting up a Raptor engine in just a second, which is mind-boggling. Of course, nobody outside the company knows in detail exactly how all the timings and ratios and all of that work. That's, after all, Raptor's secret sauce. Raptor sauce. So with that overview of Raptor, let's take a look at all the types of tests we can expect on the engine. But first, a word from this video's sponsor.
And that sponsor is Novatech, who has been pioneering the design and manufacturing of load cells for more than 50 years. These force measurement sensors are accurate throughout a range of temperatures, in high-G situations, and even in a vacuum. In fact, they've sent load cells to NASA to help test their inflatable heat shield concept known as HIAD. But it's not just the space industry who trusts Novatech. In case you didn't know, NSF is full of Formula One fans, and Novatech is playing its part in helping to make the races even safer. These load cells were used in the development of the Halo safety devices for F1 cars. For more information, check them out on their website at novatechloadcells.co.uk or check out the link in the description. And thanks again to Novatech for sponsoring this video.
Thanks, Sawyer. Before testing a Raptor, it first needs to be in the right conditions to be operated. You can't just say, let's fire it up and assume it's going to work right away. Arguably the most important part of the pre-test preparations is engine chill. During engine chill, the engine pre-valves are opened, and that lets liquid oxygen and liquid methane flow into each of the pumps at a relatively low flow rate. This process gradually lowers the temperature of these pumps down to their operating temperatures. A small flow rate allows for this thermal change to be gradual, preventing a sudden change which could damage the materials on and parts of the pump. Since the propellants also warm up and vaporize, a small flow rate prevents this vaporization from creating a sudden increase in pressure in the engine and therefore an explosion. Instead, with the vapors being created slowly, the gaseous oxygen and gaseous methane resulting from engine chill can be dealt with more easily. The engine chill process also fills up the pumps, preventing any empty spaces from being created in them, which can damage the impeller. With the engine thermally conditioned, now it's time to put it through some testing. The most simple test you can run on a Raptor is the spin prime test, or as SpaceX sometimes has called it, a chill and spin. During a spin prime test, the engine goes through the spin start phase with high-pressure inert gas being injected into both of Raptor's turbines. This drives both the fuel and oxidizer pumps and methane through the engine, but no ignition takes place on either of the preburners nor the main combustion chamber. This results in a large cloud of white vapor coming from the engines on either the ship or the booster whenever they do a spin prime of those vehicles. The spin primes on boosters look a lot more spectacular, of course, since they have 33 engines. Now you can see why SpaceX calls them a chill and spin, since during this kind of test they first chill down the engine and then they spin up the pumps. So why is this test even done at all? Well, spin primes are very helpful to not only test the Raptor itself, but also to test the ground or vehicle systems in charge of injecting the high-pressure gas needed to start the Raptor's pumps. It's the kind of test we often see when, for example, one engine gets changed out on a ship and the ship has already completed its own static fire test campaign, so they only need to verify that the new engine is hooked up properly. There's another type of test which we call preburner tests. The name is kind of self-explanatory. The thing being tested is the preburner, the fuel preburner to be more specific. These tests start just like a spin prime, with both pumps being spin started, but then it also starts the fuel preburner. The combustion in the fuel preburner creates an exhaust that goes through the hot gas manifold, down the injector and the combustion chamber, and from there it exits the engine. This results in a burst of flames coming out of the nozzle, but without any thrust produced. This kind of test is sort of like a snapshot of the middle of the startup process for Raptor. You've got both pumps running and half of the preburners running. With a preburner test, you can test a lot about the sequencing and timing of when to flow things through the engine, and you can also test the hardware that makes the torch igniters work. These kinds of tests were a whole lot more common in the past, as SpaceX was still learning how to run the engine without blowing it up by accident. Nowadays, if they happen, it's more of a thing that takes place at McGregor. In fact, the last vehicle to do any sort of preburner test at Starbase was Ship 26 on suborbital pad B. That tells you how long ago it was. To go from a preburner test to a static fire test, there's only one other major part of the engine to activate, and that is the oxygen preburner. Because now both preburners are running, both turbines can continue driving the pumps long after spin start happens. That is to say, the whole thing is self-sustaining rather than only being for a brief moment. This is the main reason why a static fire can last anywhere from a few seconds to nearly 15 minutes. That, by the way, is the current record for the longest Raptor test seen so far. In the case of the spin prime and preburner tests, those only last for a brief moment and then they stop. The static fires allow SpaceX to test everything on Raptor and its support hardware. This means you can, in theory, simulate as close to reality as one can the conditions of flight and therefore ensure that both engine, ground systems, and vehicle all work correctly before flight. Since static fires can be short, medium, or even long duration, SpaceX can even run them for the duration of the flight and simulate using the engine for multiple flight cycles. This is helpful because even before reusing a Raptor, you could, in theory, take an unflown engine and put it through the same cycles as one that is flown and then compare that with the flown one. Or you could take the flown one, put it on a test stand, and run it through multiple cycles too. Static fires in general are super helpful to test the endurance of the engine, which is of course extremely important for it to be eventually as rapidly reusable as possible. As you probably might have figured out by now, even when there are only 3 types of tests for Raptors, where they are tested determines the kind of reasoning as to why SpaceX is testing them the way they do. In other words, it's not the same doing, for example, a spin prime test at McGregor as, say, doing it on a ship after an engine swap. Let's take a look at SpaceX's development and rocket testing facility in McGregor, Texas. This is where SpaceX tests pretty much all of its engines, like Merlin and Raptor, but also the Draco and Super Draco engines used on Dragon. SpaceX also tests complete Falcon first and second stages at McGregor on dedicated test stands. Each week, SpaceX conducts about 30 engine tests on average, something you can watch on our McGregor 24/7 live stream. We keep track of each of these tests every day on a list at the top left of the screen, which allows you to rewind back to watch any of the tests of the day, even when SpaceX suddenly starts firing the same Raptor over and over and over again. Of the many tests each week, about 60% are Raptor tests and the other 40% are Merlin or Falcon tests. McGregor has its own area for testing Raptors, and it has multiple test stands. Originally, for Raptor, SpaceX only had one single test stand, the Raptor horizontal stand, with one test bay. Here, Raptors would be tested horizontally, hence the name. And it was also where the very first subscale Raptor engine was fired all the way back in 2016. The stand was upgraded to have a second test bay, and SpaceX continued operating it until last June. We believe it has now been retired in favor of other, newer test stands. About 100 meters south of the horizontal stand is the Raptor vertical stand. It's called that because that was the first stand to have Raptors firing vertically. Just like the horizontal stand, this stand has two bays, but unlike that stand, both of these are now operational. Between 2019 and 2024, SpaceX also used the old tripod stand to test Raptors. Originally built by Beale Aerospace when they were owners of the site, it was then taken over by SpaceX to test Falcon 9 rockets. When Falcon 9 became too powerful, SpaceX decided to test it next door at the Falcon booster stand and abandon the tripod stand. Then, in order to open up extra testing capacity, SpaceX decided to turn it into a Raptor stand so that they could have two bays from the horizontal stand plus the single one on the tripod. This allowed us to see the beautiful mock diamonds of Raptors, as well as all the crazy gimbaling tests they used to do on that site. Just like with the horizontal stand, SpaceX decommissioned the tripod stand in the summer of 2024 in favor of its newer stands. Those newer stands are Raptor North and Raptor South. Despite their names, these two test stands are actually to the east of the horizontal and vertical stands, but one stand is further north than the other, hence their names. Each of these stands are vertical stands, like the original Raptor vertical stand, and they also have two bays each. Raptor South was the first one to start firings and is currently in full swing with both test bays in action. Raptor North debuted just recently and only has one functional bay while the other is still being finished. Once completed, SpaceX will have a total of 6 different test bays for Raptor with 2 bays at each of its stands. SpaceX is also still upgrading the ground systems at McGregor with more deluge and cryogenic tanks, likely to enable longer duration tests. At McGregor, the Raptor engines are tested individually, so it isn't until they arrive here at Starbase that they're tested while attached to a ship or booster. If they're attached to a ship, then the engines are tested over at the Massey outpost. However, that is kind of impossible right now because the entire ship engine test stand at Massey's was destroyed during the Ship 36 explosion back in June. But when it's not destroyed, that's the location where ships get tested. Normally, these tests consist of a short-duration single-engine static fire, and more recently, they've been able to do 6-engine static fires of nearly a minute in duration. Following Ship 36's explosion, SpaceX is taking the opportunity to upgrade a bunch of systems at Massey's, which no doubt will be useful for the upcoming Block 3 ships. Now, if the engine is mounted on a Super Heavy booster, then they get tested here at the orbital launch site in Starbase. Normally, SpaceX goes straight to a 33-engine static fire test, but sometimes they may do a 33-engine spin prime test if they feel the need to further test the hardware. The orbital launch site is also where ships are being tested temporarily, given the situation right now at Massey's. For every kind of Raptor test and location, there always needs to be some kind of hardware or procedure that makes that testing possible. So let's take a look at some of that. For example, earlier when we discussed the engine chill process, I mentioned that the oxygen and methane warm up during that process. Well, that gaseous methane and oxygen needs somewhere else to go. Raptors have what are called bleed lines, which allow them to vent out the gaseous oxygen and methane during chill down. Both gases are collected from the engine, or engines, so they can be dealt with appropriately. The gaseous oxygen is generally dumped somewhere at a distance. Since it's already part of the air, no big problem there. But dealing with the methane is a little bit more tricky because it's highly flammable and also a powerful pollutant. So, depending on the location, the methane is either burned off at a flare stack, like it is at McGregor, or it is condensed again back into a liquid and sent back to the storage tanks, like it is here at the launch site. Another specific set of support hardware is the deluge systems used for Raptor test fires. Initially, SpaceX just fired Raptors at bare concrete here at Starbase, but this changed quite quickly following the results of Starship's first flight. Since then, both pads at Starbase as well as the Massey test site now include a water deluge system. The McGregor vertical stands also have a large water-cooled flame deflector and deluge system to deal with Raptor's fury. In addition to this, on Pad 1, SpaceX installed the detonation suppression system. This system sprays a mixture of gaseous nitrogen and water underneath the engines ahead of any engine test. This then disperses any potential gaseous oxygen and methane that may have accumulated under the vehicle and could create a detonation. And no, we're not going to show the Booster 7 explosion again. You might have noticed that, thankfully, we live within an atmosphere, so there's no vacuum here on the ground. This means that when SpaceX test fires Raptor vacuum engines here on Earth, the firing conditions will be different than in flight. Now, all the machinery and everything will pretty much be the same. There's no change there. But there is a change when it comes to the engine's exhaust behavior. The whole reason for the larger nozzle on a vacuum engine is because it takes advantage of the plume's expansion in a vacuum. But here on the ground, the exhaust is instead concentrated in a jet due to atmospheric pressure. This means the atmosphere will try to push in that exhaust and literally separate it away from the nozzle walls. This is what is called flow separation, and it can be really damaging to the nozzle. The Space Shuttle Orbiter's main engines also went through a similar process during their startup, which made them wobble, something you may have seen on some of the iconic slow-mo shots of shuttle engine ignitions. So, to prevent this, every time SpaceX fires an RVac on the ground, they install a bracing ring at the end of the nozzle to keep it from wobbling and breaking apart during ignition. Earlier in the video, we also mentioned that the Raptors need a high-pressure inert gas for spin start, and also high-pressure gaseous methane and oxygen for the torch igniters. That doesn't come out of nowhere. The Raptors are often hooked up to systems on the ground that provide that. At McGregor, since they're individual engines, it's a lot easier, but here in Starbase, the engines are hooked up to boosters and ships. For the current generation of boosters, these fluids are provided through individual quick disconnect arms on the launch mount for the outer 20 engines, while the inner 13 engines are fed by the main booster quick disconnect. Now, all of this Raptor testing has a purpose. Sometimes it's to verify the engine's design during development. Others, it's just to make sure that it works. But the most important reason to do all this engine testing is to verify that it'll work in flight-like conditions. This is what we sometimes call test as you fly. So what exactly is so different from a ground test relative to a launch and landing? I mean, for flight, both ship and booster have dedicated landing takes that are used for the landing burn. For the last few ships, SpaceX has been performing a single-engine static fire test of the ship's Raptors using the header tanks precisely to mimic the use of that header tank as if it were in space. We've also mentioned that there are ground-supplied commodities that get used during testing, but some of these are also used for launch as well, specifically the booster commodities. However, once in flight, the vehicles need to store the commodities needed to relight the Raptors. So, for that, SpaceX uses composite overwrapped pressure vessels, also known as COPVs. The booster COPVs are largely arranged in columns and protected by aero covers that create aerodynamic chines. For the ship, these are stored inside the nose cone, and we've seen pretty recently what can happen if one of those fails. Something that you wouldn't see, for example, during a ground test, at least for now, is the booster Raptors firing at full throttle. During a static fire test, the engines only fire up at a partial throttle setting before shutting down. For launch, they're still started at a partial throttle, but are then throttled up to let the rocket ascend once its thrust-to-weight ratio reaches higher than 1. During testing, you also don't need to worry about protecting the engines from the heat of re-entry and things like that. While early ships had bare Raptor engines, SpaceX developed specific engine shielding to protect Raptors on both booster and ship during flight and also for re-entry. None of that is needed during testing. Another thing that SpaceX has implemented over time is the fire suppression system. This is a system that flushes carbon dioxide into the enclosures created by the engine shielding to prevent the buildup of flammable gases. That system, for example, is also not needed during ground testing because the vehicles aren't running the engines for a long time, so the risk here is low. And yet, we still sometimes see SpaceX test this system and activate it during testing, especially on the booster. We mentioned how SpaceX needed to design a deluge system for its test and launch sites following several different issues during development. Well, now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that during landing, this deluge system is also activated when the booster is coming in for a catch. And it wouldn't be surprising if it happens even on Pad 2 as well. Ships and boosters also deal very differently with how they chill their engines down during flight, because of course, now there's no collector system or anything like that to get rid of the methane or oxygen resulting from this process. So what's the solution? Just vent it! It's most likely the reason why we saw, for example, on Booster 12, that giant flamethrower from its quick disconnect, since it was coming right from the line used to reclaim the methane from engine chill. There's of course a whole lot more to talk about that would make this video even longer. This is just what's happening with Raptor testing so far. But we haven't even gone through what might happen in the future. I mean, those breakaway hoses on Pad 1 for engine chill, that's gotta go away on Pad 2, right? Right? Raptor 3 is also coming up, and that is getting rid of a lot of the engine shielding, and it also won't need a fire suppression system, supposedly. As Raptor and Starship's design matures, there will likely be less of a need to do so many tests before each flight. It may just become a quick one-and-done kind of deal, like what happens nowadays with Falcon 9 first and second stages. Right now, they've just started reusing boosters, but later on down the line, they may also try and eliminate static fire tests before every reflight. The vehicles just came back from space. They work. Give it a quick look and up you go back on the pad. It'll also be very interesting to see if in the future, SpaceX stops doing booster testing on the pad altogether and creates a dedicated booster test stand like with the ship at Massey's. Oh, and all of this is just what's happening at McGregor and Starbase. We haven't even once mentioned what may happen with testing in Florida. That's going to be a whole other thing of its own. It's absolutely bonkers how SpaceX has gotten to this point, operating what is arguably one of the most complex and technologically advanced rocket engines out there. And somehow, they're making it even more powerful, more ambitious, and yet simpler all at the same time. Maybe in a few years, we'll have to come back and do a part 2 of this video, talking about all the new ways they might be testing this engine once Starship is fully operational. Alright, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to Novatech for sponsoring this video.